Hey everybody, this is Jordan McConnell with the Crohn's Veteran Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I am grateful and honored to have a very special guest with me, Dr. Albert Fliss. He is joining us from New Jersey, and this man has a very extensive career in medicine, and I am happy to talk to him. But the reason he's on the Crohn's Veteran Podcast is that he's a Crohn's warrior as well, and so. Albert, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. How about you, Jordan?
Doing good, doing good. Again, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. It's an honor to do this. Yeah.
Thank you. And so if if folks look at this podcast and look you up, they'll see that you have a really awesome career and done all these amazing things. And what I'm really interested in is that plus Crohn's disease, and how those things really intersect. And so first off, if you could, please share with, me and the folks that are listening, your diagnosis.
Sure. Yeah, my diagnosis, I would say the story of my diagnosis was I was about 19 years old. I started the university. I was at the University of Central Florida, and I joined a fraternity. And fraternities do these little pranks, like certainly the pledges do pranks on some of the members, and I was a member in one of the pledges. He thought it was a funny thing to put X-Lax in brownies.
Oh.
Okay, so he X-Lax brownies, and he gave them to all of the fraternity brothers, and everybody obviously had diarrhea and kind of had the runs for a few days. But I never stopped. So it was almost like, I'm sure it would have happened anyway, but it was kind of like, it was that precipitating factor. So I had like GI issues. I was having diarrhea, couldn't really control it. They would give me things to control it, didn't do anything, kept going to the doctor. He was kind of unsure of what it was. He kept giving me antidiarrheals, still wouldn't do anything. And then it got to the point maybe about 6 months later of this chronic illness with no real diagnosis. He was like, I'm gonna, let's put you in the hospital and let's do some diagnostic tests. My at that point, my hemoglobin was, I think, 6. So I was very, very pale. I was very, very lethargic, and things like that. And initially he thought I had some kind of bone marrow disorder, that I wasn't making red blood cells appropriately.
Okay.
So he brought me in, and they were gonna check my bone marrow to see if my bone marrow was functioning normally. And while they were doing that, they were going to do a bunch of other tests too. So they did an upper GI, a lower GI, and just the general kind of run of the mill kind of, let's check you out from head to toe. Before they pulled my bone marrow, they did an upper and a lower GI. They did an upper GI, and they noticed there was something there. At this point in time, I mean, people use the words Crohn's disease, but they also called it regional enteritis.
Okay, I haven't heard of that term before.
I haven't heard of it for a very long time, but so they called it regional enteritis, and it was really interesting, I think, and I remember it very, very well because, he said, you don't have aplastic anemia, which was it's a potential deadly disease. You only have regional enteritis or Crohn's disease. And I go back and I think about that only, he said only. And it was like, if he would have understood what I went through for the next 20 years of my life, he would have chosen his words much, much better.
For real, like people don't know the struggle. People did not know the struggle.
No. I mean, exactly. And so he diagnosed me. And he put me on prednisone, which at that point in time was really there was a prednisone and a zolfidine were the only treatments that were really used for Crohn's. He put me on prednisone, like most people who are initially have Crohn's and are put on large amounts of prednisone. I felt better in 2 days. I mean, I could like defeat the world, and they gave me a bunch of blood transfusions and got my hemoglobin up to normal levels, like 11 or 12, and I didn't realize at that point in time the implications of Crohn's. I thought it was, I have this inflammation, I get the prednisone, it would go away, and it would be, I would never see it again. So I was healthy. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, not to cut you off, but that was, a very similar situation. I was telling you before we started recording that I had Crohn's when I was 14, and so I had surgery, and then I was made in the hospital for a week, and then I was at home for a week, and then I didn't have any symptoms for another 13 years.
Wow. You
And
that
so like,
yeah.
I was able to do all these things, and so because I really thought that like, well, that sucked,
Yeah, but it's
and
done.
so
But it's
right.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so mine was very, very different because I felt better for maybe 6 months, 8 months. I felt better. And then the symptoms started creeping back. They started coming back and slowly. And then I started getting like a lot of abdominal pain, just a lot of abdominal pain. And so my GI doctor at that point in time sent me to the University of Florida because I was living in Florida for a consult because they wanted to find something other than prednisone. So I went to the University of Florida, got a consult there. They put me on something called 6-MP, 6-mercaptopurine, which is it's a leukemia drug.
Okay.
It basically it's an anti-metabolite. So they put me on that. There's no I mean, there was very little evidence that it would do anything, but there was some kind of anecdotal evidence. So he put me on that. It's still, again, I still started to get it. It didn't really do anything. And then a couple of months later, finally, I was kind of like, we need to do something because something's going on. So I went back into my doctor, and he found an actual, he palpated my abdomen, and there was a mass in there. There was essentially an abscess that had created. It was about
Mm.
as big as a football inside my
Oh
abdomen.
no. Oh no.
So what ended up happening was, with Crohn's, you get these fun things called fistula.
Yes, sir.
So a fistula went from my abdominal, essentially my intestines, to out. It tried to go outside, but it couldn't make it. So it formed an abscess. So I was immediately put in the hospital. I was in the hospital for, I think, 18 days. They wouldn't let me eat anything because they were hoping that they could get rid of the abscess and close up the fistulas if I didn't eat food or drink water. So I was on kind of parental feeding in a tube, through one of my my big veins going into my heart for 18 days.
Wow.
Yeah, so no food, no water, just IV liquids. At the end of the 18 days, it had closed. The fistula had closed, and that abscess had looked like it was healed. I went home. I started eating and drinking. Immediately, it opened back up again.
I was gonna ask you, so what was your physical state after that 18 days?
Not. I had lost a lot of weight. I mean, I had lost a lot of weight, and okay, again, weak. Definitely weak. But then it became even more of an issue because the abscess was gone, but now there was a draining fistula coming out of my abdomen.
Wow.
It's called
Wow.
an enterocutaneous fistula. So basically, contents were coming out of my intestines and draining out of my abdomen.
I had something very similar, and and when I was in 2009, I was telling you when I got sick again, that's kind of been sick ever since, is that, I went to the emergency room several times that year, like a couple of
Yeah,
times due to pain, third time I had a temporary ileostomy,
yeah.
and then, and that was a horrible experience. And then
It is. Yeah,
the fourth time was, actually being admitted and having like 18 inches of my colon taken out, and
yeah,
my ileum taken out and all that stuff. And so,
yeah.
but please go ahead.
Especially when you're young. I mean, I was relative. I mean, this was my college years, and
Mhm.
obviously you were relatively young, and so this is like, it impacts your entire social life. So,
Right.
and I'll give you the details about what I had to do to navigate it, because there really was no way to navigate it. So what I would do is, stuff would come out, and obviously it contained digestive fluids,
Mm.
and it was very irritating. So they and there were a bunch of holes that it would come out of. So I couldn't use like an ostomy appliance.
Mm.
An ostomy appliance wouldn't work. I'd have to have a bunch of them. It would be, so for 2.5 years, and this was while I was going to college. I was getting my
Right.
undergraduate degree.
Right.
I had to, every morning I had to get zinc oxide, and I had to coat my entire abdomen with zinc oxide to protect from the acids in my stomach and the digestive enzymes. And then on top of that, because I would put gauze on it, and then I would actually get a disposable diaper, and I would cut it open and I would wrap it around my waist. So every morning I would have to do this whole thing, to protect my skin and protect from essentially things going everywhere. Because again,
Right.
you couldn't control this. So I went through most of my undergraduate career. I had this on my abdomen.
Mm. I said that's the exact reason why I call the show Crohn's Veteran. You
Yeah.
know,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
is that is those kind of stories is
Yeah.
still going to school every day, still knocking out those responsibilities,
Mm.
but behind the scenes,
Yeah.
you're doing all that stuff.
And trying to date and
Right.
trying to start relationships and stuff
Mm.
like that. And then finally it was like, and I stayed at the same GI doctor, and he wasn't a very proactive individual. He was like, I'm not going to do anything extraordinary. We're just going to wait to see what happens. And I got frustrated. I got really, really frustrated. And I was in science. So I kept up on literature. I looked through all of the research. And so I found another GI doctor that I thought would help me more. And so I went to him armed with a lot of publications, manuscripts from papers, scientific data, and says, with ideas about how to potentially treat me. So I don't know, how old was I? Maybe I was like 21 at that point in time. And I remember going into his office and basically, 21-year-old kid going into this big GI doctor's office and telling him, he, basically reading the papers to him and telling him,
Right.
this is what I think, blah, 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 blah. And at the end of my kind of monologue with him, he said, you know what? How about you see the rest of my patients and I'm going to go play golf?
Oh my gosh.
Because he said, you know more about Crohn's disease than I know about Crohn's disease, because
Wow.
I scoured the literature and I knew every little piece of data, wherever it may be, and kind of put it together. So I went to him. He realized that it was the point in time where I can't keep doing this, wrapping my abdomen every day. This is not something you could continue on. So
Yeah, and that's not sustainable at all.
no, it's not. It's not. And so he referred me to a surgeon. The surgeon, I had surgery. I think it was in, when I was like about 22 years old. They took out like a couple of feet of intestines. They took out a foot of small intestines, a foot of large intestines, and then the connector in between, the cecum, and put me back together. Again, after that, they put me on some prednisone. I felt great. I gained weight. I got my weight back. I became, more healthy and things like that. And maybe another about a year and a half or 2 years, I maintained my relative health. And then at that point in time, I had really started my first real professional job. I worked for the University of Florida as a
Yeah.
scientist. Yeah. And, I guess probably, the stress of new job and, kind of, being away from home, and the stress started and maybe about a year and a half into my new job. And I was married at that point in time. So I had a girl, and I ended up marrying, and then I started getting, again, this pain, and I had some diarrhea and stuff like that, but mostly just pain. It was mostly pain. And I remember for like a week, I would like take Tylenol, and I just keep taking Tylenol. I just pop Tylenol to keep the
Right.
pain
Like,
at bay. And when you have Crohn's disease, you learn how to deal with pain, because you have to live with it, unfortunately. And so maybe about 4 or 5 days, I kept doing it. And then one morning, I think it was like 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up and I was in such excruciating pain that I called my doctor on his emergency line, and and basically said, I can't do it anymore. I said, can't do it. You got to do something for me because I can't. So he sent me to the hospital. He met me at the hospital, and then the next next almost full day, and I was in excruciating pain to the point where morphine or oxy, it didn't do it.
I have unfortunately been there myself.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, it just didn't do it. And so they weren't sure exactly what was going on. So they did a bunch of GI stuff, and they noticed there was a bunch of air pockets that seemed to be in my intestines, but they were confused and they couldn't really get a good idea what was going on inside. And then after about a day, they decided we got to do exploratory surgery because we're just not sure. We don't know what in the hell's happening in there. So they opened me up, and obviously like 4 days before, my intestines had perforated.
Wow.
So my whole gut was full of pus. Massive.
You're in bad shape.
Yeah. And the surgeon said it's probably been festering in there for like 5 days. I mean, usually when somebody gets a perforated intestines, they're dead in 3 hours because that's just the way it happens. So they went in, and there was a massive infection. So they had to take all my intestinal contents, they took my abdominal contents out and placed it next. This is the surgeon told me the story. They put them next to my body, and they had to rinse me out with like sterile saline and peroxide and whatever they could to reduce the bacterial burden inside of my body. They cleaned me out. They put my intestines back in. They took a piece of my intestine.
Let me just say I'm happy you're still here, man. Like,
yeah. This is one of many. I mean, so it's like, so they couldn't sew me back up because I had a raging infection inside. So they put me on IV antibiotics. You know, they told my family at that point in time that the next 12 hours would be the difference whether I survived or I didn't, because it was such a raging infection inside. I was fine. I mean, I didn't spike a fever. I went through the next few days and I felt better. You know, that bad piece of intestines was out. But now I was from like right below my ribs to right above, right above, kind of below the belly button. When I had a belly button, there was a cut, and they couldn't suture it together. So what they did is they put a suture on each side. They had 2 sutures on each side of my back, and they actually had 2 large rubber bands that were actually holding my abdomen relatively closed.
Wow.
Because they had to let it heal from the inside out. Because if they closed it up, I would get an abscess. So over the next 6 weeks, I went to work. I went to school with this contraption on my abdomen. And after about 6 weeks, it had sealed up. Everything had sealed up, and at that point in time, I was also on a temporary ileostomy because, they had to let things rest in there. So I was good. And then about 6 months later, I was very anxious to get the ileostomy reversed. So I think it was 3 or 4. It was actually a week before Christmas. I scheduled my surgery. I went in and I got my thing reversed. I was out of the hospital in like 3 days. I actually made Christmas dinner because that's just the way you have to be. Because, it's like, so I was good. Again, I was good for maybe another year and usually every year and a half, or 2 years is really what, I would be good for that period of time.
Yeah.
And then things would start going awry. And then in between there, again, I had another incident where I had, pain and kind of partial obstruction, and they had to go in again, and they had to take another piece of intestines out. So this is now, I think, my 3rd surgery, 3rd or 4th, if you include the reconnection surgery.
Right.
So then I was still working the whole time. I was working and actually going to school to get a degree in chemical engineering also. I was working the whole time, and then, maybe a couple of years later, it was good for a couple of years. And then I was going through a particular stressful part of my life, actually, where I was, my first marriage was ending because,
Mm,
there were, not related to Crohn's disease, but it just was
right.
happening. And, and I had found somebody that I wanted to actually spend the rest of my life with, so that was kind of a stressful time. And of course, what happens with stress, when
Right.
we have
It's
Crohn's,
interesting. It's interesting you say that because I almost had a similar experience. I have a,
really
yeah, ex-wife too, and so and met my current wife, and we've actually been together the longest. I've been with everything's
awesome.
awesome, and
Good, good, good.
I'm very very grateful for her, my son.
Of
Every
course.
everybody, and but yeah, but of course, that previous relationship, ending, and and that and that transitionary period and all
Yeah.
those things, even though I was having a ton of fun, and
Yeah.
dating my dating my new girlfriend, and who turned to be my wife later, like I still ended up going to the hospital,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
so.
Because even though there's good stuff, it's still, it's
Mm,
change. It's big
mm,
change in your life.
mm,
Yeah,
mm,
absolutely. So we have very similar. I could see a lot
mm,
a lot of similarity, and I'm
yeah,
assuming that's the way it go. I mean, me and you are not the only ones. I'm sure
no,
there's many stories that are very similar. So I became sick again. Um, and I remember this very, 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 very vividly. It was like it was again a few days before Christmas. Somehow, always Christmas always precipitated some issues here. So it was a few days before Christmas, and I was actually, you know, had Christmas Eve dinner over my house with family members, and I made homemade stuff. I made like homemade pasta and meatballs and sauce because I'm half Italian. And so I did that, and it was really, really good. It was really, really cool. I ate a lot, and that evening, obviously, stuff had been going on inside, and
right.
at that point, I totally obstructed to the point where, and I knew I totally obstructed because I know the medicine and the science well enough because
Mm.
I was feeling nauseous. I went into the bathroom. I vomited stuff that's supposed to come out the other end.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Oh no.
yeah. Which is, it's, yeah. So immediately I knew when that happened that I had a total obstruction in my intestines because there's no way for it to go down. Again, I drove myself to the hospital and yeah.
Right. And so, so throughout this, especially, when you were in college and when you're, older and stuff, how was your family, you know, impacted, through all this?
I mean, I honestly, I tried. I'm a kind of a person that kind of sucks it up and
Mhm.
just kind of has this kind of barrier almost, as far as I'll suck up the pain and discomfort, and I'll put on a happy face. That's just it's me. Um, you know, so a lot of the time, I don't think people really, I don't think, meaning, I don't think people really understood the level of what you're going through. It's difficult. I mean, they certainly had my first wife, and then obviously my wife now. I mean, she went through, even worse stuff. So, but you suck it in. It's almost like kind of, I kind of, an analogy is, like a wolf gets injured, and they wander off, and they go into the woods, and they heal themselves, and they
Right.
lick their wounds, and they rest, and hopefully they could heal themselves and then come back. So that was kind of it. But obviously it affected relationships, and it probably affected my first relationship more than it did my wife now.
Mm.
um so I went into the hospital again, and and they, I was in there for a while because don't ever have surgery around Christmas, because my surgeon was also going to the Sugar Bowl, and he had tickets for like a long time. And he said, Al, he said, I can't put you together right now because you're too inflamed. So we're going to have to wait like 8 or 9 days. So we're going to stabilize you in the hospital and stuff like that. So they put an NG tube down. They had suction going down. They're sucking stuff out.
Oh
So
no.
I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks. They put me together. I was very weak at the end of this. I was in. And one thing that was interesting is, each time they took a little bit of intestines out. But it's interesting how when they take intestines out, and especially in some of these situations that I was in, which were borderline emergency situations, the record keeping of how much intestines they take out is lacking. So I had my surgery, and they put me back together. It took me maybe about 4 or 5, 6 weeks to kind of regain my strength. I went back to work. I continued to go to school. And then I was a little bit better. I started getting better, and that's the time where actually my current wife now, she was a graduate student in the University of Florida. Her professor moved to Texas, so she moved ahead of me because we were not married then.
Right,
And
right.
very shortly after I healed, I was moving. So I left my home state of Florida, and I moved to Texas with my wife. My current wife, we got married. I was relatively healthy for, I would say, 2.5 or 3 years, maybe 2.5 or 3 years. And then again, stress happens. We
Right.
decided to move from Texas because Texas is an interesting place. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, trust me. I graduated high school there. I went to, from Austin. So
Yeah. Texas is an interesting place. Certain parts of it. Austin is actually good. I like Austin, but there's certain parts that are a little bit different.
different.
I'll leave it at that because I don't want to diss anybody. So my wife wasn't happy in Texas, and so she's used to big cities, and so I ended up getting another job up in the Northeast United States, basically in upstate New York, working for a pharmaceutical company. And so we moved, we lifted everything up from Texas. We moved everything with our dog, and, moved up to Connecticut, started another job, and got married in Connecticut. And, then started graduate school because I got my bachelor's degree a long time ago. And then I went back to get my actual doctorate degree.
Gotcha.
So me and my wife moved to New York City because it was too far of a commute for her originally to go to graduate school. Then I started so we moved to Manhattan, which is probably another stress. It's definitely, I'm from kind of like, small town Florida. We lived in a small town in Texas, and then now you're going to the Big Apple. So,
Right.
life is stress. And so then I started graduate school, and this was probably a lot of this situation was probably on me because I probably did something stupid. So I started graduate school, but I didn't quit working. So I worked out a schedule with my employer that I would do the reverse commute from Manhattan to upstate New York in the morning. So I would leave home at about 4:30 in the morning. I would drive up the 20-minute drive up to where I worked in further upstate New York. I would work until about 9 in the morning there. Then I would do the commute back to New York City, and I would start in the lab at school and do my classes and do my lab work. And then at about 5 o'clock, I would go the reverse. I would go back to my company up in upstate New York, work until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and then I would come home. So my hours were essentially 4:30 in the morning until about midnight.
And how long were you doing that?
6 months. So I ended up kind of getting myself in trouble. By I think it was just too much stress, and I got sick. And it was interesting because so I didn't have surgery immediately, but I had a lot of side issues with Crohn's disease. But at that point in time, so I was working, and I was going to school. And at the beginning of your PhD program, you go through these things called rotations. You kind of go to one lab and you kind of try it out. And you do some experiments, and then you go to the next lab, and you kind of figure it out at the end where you want to spend the next 4 years of your life doing your PhD research.
That
So
makes sense.
when I got really sick, so I did a couple of rotations. When I got really sick, this one individual that I did a rotation for, he was particularly harsh because I was sick, impacted his experiments. And so he sat me down and he said, I think you should reconsider your career.
That's not well, the good news is that you get to decide that, not him.
Yeah. Because if he actually really knew me, that's throwing the gauntlet down. That is like, okay, I'm gonna prove you wrong, and I'm gonna prove you wrong in a big way, because I'm gonna do exactly what you told me I can't do. Okay, so I got sick, and I started. And actually, after the last surgery, I also had an ileostomy. So I still had an ileostomy, and I was in graduate school, and I had finally made the decision on, after this guy kind of read me the riot act, I made the decision on who I'm going to work in the lab with, which was obviously not him. So I found a person that was understanding and understands, we're people. We're people, And so I started working in his lab, and at that point in time, I started getting these fistulas again. It started with one. There was one like right where my belly button would have been when it was still there. It started draining. It was manageable because a little bit of stuff would come out every day. So I would put a bandage on it, and I could deal with it. So I continued with graduate school, and periodically another one would pop up. And eventually, over the next period of like 4 or 5 years, I had like a bunch of satellite little holes in my abdomen that ultimately were draining stuff that, coming from my intestines. So again, I dealt with them. I found these little ostomy bag kind of appliances that are very tiny, and I had like 6 things on my abdomen. So my whole abdomen was covered with these appliances, basically. But I made it work. It worked for me. I did it, and because you kind of got to do what you have to do to make it. And so I started graduate school in my lab I think it was like summer of 1995. And I continued to do my research. I published a lot of my work. I worked in the cancer space, breast cancer and prostate cancer. I ended up finishing my PhD in record time, in a little bit over 3 years, which was kind of unheard of. So that was my payback for that guy. So every time I would see that guy in the hallway, I would say, hey, I published another paper. And when I graduated, I made sure he knew I graduated, and I graduated 4 years before the same students that were in his lab when I did the rotation.
I was gonna ask you that. So so very, very awesome. You got to believe in yourself. To anybody out there that's listening, do not let other people determine, what you are and what you're not, capable of.
Exactly. And so in that whole gamish, I was going around to different GI doctors at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, is where I went to school. And like I told you, I was really into all the research in Crohn's. And so I had all the data. I know everything that's going on. And I decided, based on the data, that I wanted to try something different. Because there's some early data in the 1980s that suggested, at least, that in part Crohn's disease is initiated by a bacterial infection. Okay, so
Yeah, I
So
think
I saw that.
mhm.
Go ahead. What were you going to say, Jordan?
Oh, I was gonna say
Were you gonna,
I think I'm familiar with that research too.
mycobacterium. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so I latched onto that. And again, you're in a situation where you got to find something that works for you. So I designed my own treatment regimen, and I went to my doctor at Mount Sinai with all my papers, all the papers again. And I told him, I said, I want you to give me this, this, and this. And they were all approved drugs. They were all generic drugs that were available, readily available, and actually quite cheap. And so he looked at me and he said, based on what you showed me, that I don't have enough proof to say that, I could, that, this is going to work for you. And I looked at him and I said, I don't really have options here. I mean, you're not doing any, I mean, I'm not going anywhere here. This is not getting any better. And I asked him, I said, if you give this to me, will it hurt me? And he said, no, it won't hurt you. So I said, then you're going to give it to me. So I convinced
Exactly.
him to give me the drug regimen that I designed.
Wow.
And so throughout graduate school, unfortunately, when I left graduate school, I took this drug combination for 7 years, because I knew it would take a long time to do anything. So I finished graduate school. I went off to my postdoc at the university in Maryland, in Baltimore. And fortunately, I was able to convince another GI doctor to continuing me on the regimen. So I found somebody who was willing to listen to me. So I continued on the regimen. I didn't get any worse, but certainly by that point in time, I had so many fistulas everywhere. I had fistulas going from my intestines to my bladder. I had fistulas going from one part of the intestines to the other. I had fistulas that were trying to go to my lungs. I had numerous fistulas that were coming out of my draining in my abdomen. So it was a point in time where, my doctor said, you can't go on like this forever, because ultimately you're going to succumb to some kind of a weird infection, because
Right.
you have stuff going everywhere. This is, especially my bladder. So, I consulted with my physician. And at that point in time, me and my wife had a son who was 2 years, a year and a half old. And my wife was pregnant with our daughter, who was, born, after. And she, and he told me, he said, he told me, he was very honest. He said, Al, he said, I don't want you to go through surgery now. This is too much stress. You have a 1.5-year-old. Your wife is pregnant. This is way too much stress for you to go through this major, potentially surgery. So he said, let's wait until your daughter is 6 months old. So I had to wait another basically year and a half, kind of just
Mm.
holding in a holding pattern. And my life was, I was a postdoc in the University of Maryland. I got my own grants and funded my own research. But I would go to work early in the morning. I would come back, 6, 7 o'clock at night, we pick the kids up and everything. My wife was also a postdoc. I would get home, and in the basement, I had this rocker recliner, this kind of cushy rocker recliner. And I would just have to just take pain meds and just rock myself to sleep, because that was the only way I could actually deal with it. Because the fistulas caused a lot of pain. So, I was prescribed a lot of pain medication. So I would essentially take my medication, sit in front of the TV, rock myself to sleep, which ultimately, I mean, again, that, in ways, that obviously will affect in somehow your relationships, because you kind of wall yourself off, and you kind of, I'm going to sit on my thing, and I'm going to, because I can't actually deal with anything else, because I'm right now I'm dealing with too much stuff. So, the time came around, it was daughter was born, and it was, I think, about 3 or 4 months before that time I'm going to have surgery. And so I found a really, really good surgeon at the University of Maryland. My wife found a very, very good surgeon for me at Johns Hopkins. And I had to make a choice. It was like, it was an interesting choice, because the person at University of Maryland said, no worries. this is a piece of cake. No problem whatsoever. And I knew it wasn't a piece of cake. You know, I was a mess. I mean, I had a lot of scar tissue inside, a lot of strict. I mean, this wasn't, I went to the other doctor and he was like, again, he was like, this is tough. I mean, you know, I'm not going to make you any guarantees here, but I'm going to make sure to go through. I want to know exactly what's going on inside of you before I do the surgery. So every diagnostic test in the world, I mean, they were injecting dye into my fistulas to see where they're going. It was very painful, but he said, that's the only way I'm going to do this because I don't want to go in there and have a bunch of surprises out. So I had like diagnostic tests for like 3 months nonstop. And my surgery day came. Okay. So my wife and my dad came to surgery with me. My mom stayed home at our house in Maryland with our tap prepped and everything like that. Right before I go into surgery, you know, my wife and my dad are there, and the surgeon comes in and he goes through the risks, you know, and he was very, very he said, honestly, Al, I'm not feeling very good about the situation. You know, I mean, there's a number of things. You could die on the table because this is a very long surgery. And at that point in time, I was 110 pounds.
Mm.
I'm 6 foot.
I was about to ask you that. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
wow.
So you could die on the table. You could, because he said this is going to be an all-day surgery. He prepared us for all-day surgery. So you could die on the table. He says, if I take these fistulas out in the piece of intestines where they're coming from, there's no guarantee that won't come back next week or the week after. And you're back at the same situation you are now. So he said, you know, I don't want to get your hopes up because again, you know, but he said he also realized, he said, you have no options. You can't continue doing what you're doing because you're going to succumb to an infection at some point in time. So we got to do something, you know, we got to try to move the needle. So I went into surgery at 7 o'clock in the morning. So at some point my dad went home because it was long, and my wife stayed at the hospital. I think it was 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. The surgeon came in and he sat down with her. And that was interesting. And she kind of translated all this to me. It was like, he went in there and he said, I'm not sure what's going on because you're missing over half of, almost half of your intestines are gone. And according to the surgical records, you should only be missing like 3 feet or 4 feet of intestines. So he says, I don't know what happened here, but he told me, he said, you're on the verge of something called short bowel syndrome. And I don't know if you know about short bowel syndrome, Jordan.
I do.
Which means you're basically, you're on IV fluids overnight, every night for the rest of your life because you can't absorb enough food in your intestines. So while I was on the surgical table, he took my intestines out and he measured them on the table because he knew how wide the table was. He said I had 10 feet of small intestines left. So half of my small intestines. So he told me, he said, you can't lose any more, Al. He says, you got to do whatever you could. We can't, you know. So he told me, he said, if you ever need more surgery down the road, you have to come to me because I will ensure that I preserve as much intestines as I could possibly preserve.
Question for you.
Yeah.
So are you familiar with bile acid malabsorption? And you know, and how does that relate? And how does that relate to short bowel?
I mean,
because that's what, you know, because like that's because when I had my ileum taken out and stuff, that's kind of where I'm now. Like before the surgery, I could eat whatever I wanted to, and then after the surgery, like it was like pretty much diarrhea like for the rest, just forever. And so now I'm on like this cholestyramine or Prevalite.
I know.
Powder.
Yeah. Because actually in the I forgot to tell you, I think it was in the surgery. It was either in this last big surgery that I had or the surgery before that. They took all my bile ducts out and they took my gallbladder out because they said it was it had looks like it was, because again, anything in your GI tract could get Crohn's disease. So he took it out and they put me on that cholesterol, but for some miracle, for some miracle that I cannot explain and I would never explain, I don't have that problem.
Interesting. Well,
And I
I
don't,
hope you never. I hope you never get that problem.
because at some point in time, Jordan, I think I'm a medical anomaly. I don't know, but it's like, so I had the surgery, you know, and he was prepared to keep me in intensive care for a week, because he said a 10-hour, 11-hour surgery, your body is not going to be able to recover. So I wake up in the recovery room, and my wife tells me all of the information. And ultimately, what was going on in there, Jordan, there was a piece of intestines this big. And that's where everything was coming from. 2 inches. So he went in and he took 2 inches of intestines out. That was it.
Wow.
All of that was causing all of that problem. Everything else in my intestines was clean. So my wife told me what was going on. I woke up in the recovery room. They moved me to ICU. About 20 minutes later, they kicked me out of ICU because they said, there's no reason for you to be in ICU, because you're fine. So I stayed in the hospital 4 more days. I convinced my physician to get me the hell out of the hospital, because I don't like hospitals. So I think it was on the 5th day I went home, to recover at home. It took me, I'd say, about, because again, I was a little bit older, I was like almost, 40-ish or whatever, late 30s, a little bit longer. Because again, as we get older, Jordan, it takes longer to recover. I mean, hopefully you don't have any more surgeries, I hope, but your body is just can't rejuvenate itself as much. So I would say I stayed off of my work, because I was a postdoc at university for 3 weeks, but I wasn't full strength until I gotta say 6 weeks. But what I was doing, again, tying back to the treatment, I designed my treatment, and my treatment was based on getting rid of this microorganism that is deeply rooted in my immune system, and comes out periodically and causes these problems. So after I had my surgery, I was like, I'm going to stay on this therapy for 3 more months. Okay. So it was at that point in time, I think it was September. And I was like, I'm stopping it. I'm stopping that, and I was on a whole bunch of other medications. I was on Remicade. I was on all sorts of biologicals and stuff like that. The group of antibiotics that I stopped on September, and this was September 2001.
Okay.
This was essentially, again, it was a few days before 9/11. And also myself, another dumb person, kind of like we both are, I think. It's like, I moved to New York City.
And he had no idea how your life is.
You joined the military. I moved up to where all hell was breaking loose. So that's September 2021. I have not taken any medicine since that point in time.
What? So since 9/11, more or less?
20, it's going to be 22 years.
Wow.
No medicine.
Wow.
No medicines.
That's a hell of a story, Dr. Fliss.
I was doing my postdoc in 2021 when this happened. I mean, since that point in time, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry, the biotech. I've worked in academia, and kind of moved myself up. Always, again, for me, it's important, because when you're a patient, you understand. So when I'm on the other side, and I'm somebody who develops medications for patients, whether it's Crohn's disease or whether it's lung cancer or breast cancer or whatever it is, the experience that I gained from being a patient for, Jordan, like 15 years, being a patient for 15 years, I wouldn't trade it. I mean, my mom passed away, but I remember she would get on the phone with me when I was sick, and she would blame God. And she said, I don't know what God. I was able to survive it. So, I mean, maybe other people wouldn't be able to survive it, but I was strong enough to survive it because every moment, especially when I had kids, it was like, when I went into that big surgery and the doctor said all sorts of bad things. My wife said she was ready to just take me and take me home. She didn't want me to go through the surgery, but there was no point in time where I was going to let myself succumb to this disease.
Same, same. And that's
I was gonna crush it. And I mean, and it's like, and so what happened in like 20, it was actually literally 3 months before I had surgery, when I was going through all these diagnostic tests, I got myself involved in kind of the, I would say, patient support advocacy community. Because before they have all these really cool websites that you could interact with Crohn's disease people, they had this one website. It was called IBD Sucks. And you're too young probably to even know about it. So when I was in graduate school, they had this site called IBD Sucks. And so what I did was, one day I got on the site, and again, I know what people with Crohn's go through, and I know Crohn's disease. I probably have the worst I have the worst case he had ever seen. And so I would go on the website and I would see these people complaining about, for me, things in my world and compared to what I was going through were trivial. So I got really mad one day, and I wrote this dissertation on the blog. It was literally, I mean, it took me like 4 hours to put it on there. I armed them with data, and I armed them with my theory. And again, my theory was based on the treatment that I ended up kind of concocting. I said, do something. Let's do something. Okay. And so I sent that out. 2 people responded to me. Okay. 2 people only. One dude from Ireland, his name was Alan Kennedy. And another girl from University of Pennsylvania. She was really, really young. She was like 19 years old. And she had gotten Crohn's when she was really young, and it had greatly affected her life. So Alan reaches out to me and he says, and he connects with me, and he says, he said, Al, there's this disease in Ireland cattle, but it's almost identical to Crohn's disease, although it's in a cow. And it's caused by this microorganism called Mycobacterium paratuberculosis. Okay. And I was like, and so the organism that I thought, based on the early research, was the same organism that he was saying was causing almost an identical disease in cows. So that was like a big connection for me. And so he was an IT guy. He was a big IT guy. He had his own consulting company. And so I was teaching him science. I was teaching him medical science. So he was very interested in all the papers. So I would digest the papers, I would summarize them, and I would explain the science to him. And then I've been doing that for like a year. And then after about a year, I remember I was in my lab in New York, and I get this call, and I usually don't get calls on the hardline phone in the lab. And I picked it up, and he said, "This is Alan." And and it was like, I was kind of like taken aback because, I don't get calls from Ireland usually. And, he said, Al, he said, I've been, really, really thinking about it hard over the last year. He said, do you think it would be worth it for him to take off a year from what he's doing and devote his entire time to getting the word out about this Crohn's disease and about potential connections to infectious diseases? And I said, yes, if you could afford to do it, if you could take off for a year, please do it. And so I continued to help him. He ended up speaking all over the world.
Wow.
Before he could actually go in front of people. So the interesting connection is, okay, so, and then there's this other girl, this 19-year-old who was going to the University of Pennsylvania. young girl, Crohn's. I mean, it really affected her life. I think she was like 7 or 8 years old when she had it. It affected her development. She was very tiny. It affected all of her organ systems. And so I would keep in touch with her because I think she needed my moral support. So I would email her, I would send her letters. She would send me a picture of her and her dog or something like that. And so, and I obviously, she knew about the data that I talked to the other folks about. And then fast forward like maybe 2 years, when I had moved to Maryland and I had started my postdoc position, she had maybe about 6 months before my surgery, she reached out to me and she said, "Hey, Al, I saw this organization. It was called PARA. It was called the Paratuberculosis Awareness and Research Association. And it seems like they're talking about the same ideas that you've been talking about for the last few years." And so I was like, wow, that's the coincidence thing. She was the one who told me, and the only two people connected with me, but it had to be those two people. So she sent me the information. I looked at it, and Alan Kennedy, this was a few years later. Alan he started this organization with 2 other women who were and a man who were at wit's ends because either their children or their spouses were afflicted with very severe Crohn's disease, and they were no options. I mean, they couldn't find any answers. They couldn't find any answers. So I reached out to Alan. Alan introduced me to the whole organization, this PARA organization, and kind of ultimately saying that, well, the reason why this organization exists is because Al spent the time to kind of, make sure I understand this and supported me. So I became involved in that organization, and I ultimately became the head of the scientific and medical steering committee for the organization.
Very cool stuff.
3 months before 3 or 4 months before the actual my surgery, I get a call on the phone from the 2 women, and I was living in Baltimore at that point in time, outside of Baltimore. And they said that they're coming up to DC because they're talking to Congress. So they actually had an appointment to testify before the House Appropriations Committee to try to get increased funding for Crohn's disease research associated with a potential infectious cause.
Wow. Very, very, very cool.
So they called me and they were like, and they said, "Do you want to come?" And of course I said, "Yeah, of course I want to come." So I was like, I hopped on actually one of the members, which was the guy, he stayed at my house. He didn't, he stayed at my house, and me and him and everybody, we headed into the city. We headed into whatever, I forget the building, but it was wherever the House Appropriation Committee meets. And so, went through security, went in the building, and the leader of the organization, which was a woman, she had a very, very scripted, and there were a lot of other people from other, organizations that dealt with, diseases that are underfunded. So she testified. She did a really, really good job, and I was in the audience, so I was sitting back in the audience. And so the head of the committee, and I can't remember his name at that point, but I know Nancy Pelosi was actually, I believe she was on the committee. And I think, so he asked her, he said, you've told me a lot of information, but, do you have anybody that could really help me understand the story of what Crohn's disease is and what you go through? So I got just picked out of the audience and had to answer questions from the chair of the House Appropriations Committee.
On the spot like that.
On the fly, because I had no idea this would ever be possible. And I was going there because it was cool to be there. I'd never been there, and to see Congress and to actually see this. It was like, yeah. So I ended up, I don't know. I don't even remember how long it was, because I was kind of like, at that point, starstruck, because, it was like, wow, this is like incredible. So I added to the testimony, and then the next day, it happened to be, and again, this is another weird coincidence. It happened to be that my gastroenterologist that was my doctor at the University of Maryland ended up getting a new job several months before, and he was actually the associate director of the National Institute of Digestive Disease and Kidney Disorders at NIH. So I was able to set up a meeting with that whole organization, and essentially the second person in charge of NIH. So it was a very interesting time. And I continued to work with them for a number of years. And I think it was about 2 years ago, I got involved with another organization called Propel a Cure. It's another Crohn's disease organization.
Okay.
And I was on the board of directors. I was VP of that for several months. And unfortunately, my work got too busy, and there were some health problems in the family that I kind of had to bow out for that for a while. But it's, I mean, yeah, I like to give back. I mean, and as you noted, I mean, it's like, I mean, probably the things I volunteer for are as large as the places that I worked. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this conversation has been about twice as long as I usually have it, but
I know it. I know. See,
I enjoyed every minute.
Jordan, that's what happens when you ask me to talk.
Well, I enjoyed listening to your story. I enjoyed, I'm sure that folks are really going to enjoy listening to what you have to say. Any parting wisdom?
Don't let it define you. Do not, because once you let it, you aren't, I mean, a person who has Crohn's disease is not Crohn's disease. They're a person that happens to be dealing with something. And for the external world, is like, somebody, may say, oh, it's, like my physician said, oh, it's only an inflammatory bowel disease. What we go through, I would not wish on my worst enemy.
Facts. Big time.
Wouldn't wish on my worst enemy.
100%.
Nobody deserves this. And honestly, Jordan, bless you for doing this. Kind of putting yourself out there, and keep doing it. This is, I mean, it's important. I mean, increasing awareness this is all power.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And that's the plan. And so I have big plans for the rest of this year.
Good.
To try to do more fun things to grow the lifestyle brand, grow Crohn's better, and all that kind of stuff. And so
yeah.
Again, I guess, thank you for being here. To anybody who's listening,
welcome.
Thank you. And so to anybody who's listening right now, if you found value in what Dr. Fliss, has shared today, if you find value in what I'm doing, please, share this podcast, subscribe to this podcast. We're on Spotify, Apple, Google. I have a YouTube channel, my website, crohnsveteran.com. You can, buy Crohn's and colitis merch, awareness
cool.
merch.
I saw that. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So that's all me, but I'm IT guy, so I put all that together. And so so please, support, and help me raise awareness, and send in peace and love to you and your family,
Same to you and yours. And if you reach out to me anytime if you need any assistance with anything. Okay.
Thank you, sir. And take care of yourself, and have a good night.
You too.
All right,
bye-bye.